And welcome back to the 2017 Virtual Genealogy Fair. If you are following along from home, this is session number 5 and the first of 2 talks on records about Japanese and Japanese Americans during World War II. This lecture is Locating the Relocated, Deciphering Electronic Records on Japanese Americans Interned during World War II. And our speakers are LeGloahec and Jana Leighton. During this session, we will provide guidance on how to search some of our online resources to get a more complete picture of our holdings of Japanese American internee records. We will look at National Archives' access to Archival Databases, AAD, as well as digitized textual records in the National Archives catalog. Mr. LeGloahec is an archives specialist, and Jana Leighton is an archivist at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. I am now turning the microphone over to LeGloahec and Jana Leighton. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon and welcome to all of you out there for session 5 of the 2017 Virtual Genealogy Fair, Locating the Relocated. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon along with my colleague in the Electronic Records Division, Jana Leighton. In the session that will follow ours, you'll hear from another of our colleagues, Gwen Granados, who will join us virtually from Nara Riverside to discuss related records on this topic. It is important to talk about this topic in the 65th anniversary of the issuance of Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in February of 1942, which called for the confinement of all Japanese, German, and Italian Americans, though primarily directed at Japanese Americans. I hope that everyone had a chance to download the handouts for this presentation, specifically those concerning NARA's access to archival databases, on which my portion of this presentation will be focused. By way of some introduction to what Jana and I do on a daily basis, I want to give a little background on the work of the Electronic Records Division. We are the custodial unit responsible for the born digital records of the federal government, the records that have never existed on paper. Now, of course, the Japanese American internee records, which we are discussing today, were converted to an electronic file in the 1960s. The government had gathered the information as part of processing individuals into camps and originally captured the information on computer punch cards. The records maintained by the Electronic Records Division are primarily raw statistical data, but there is an advantage insofar as these are the records of the future that you can access now. In most cases, electronic records are transferred to the National Archives because of their risk of technological obsolescence. If the raw data is relatively clean, the records can be processed and made available within a short period of time. For example, within just a few years of the end of the Vietnam War, the National Archives had accessioned many of the operational and casualty records of that conflict. The Electronic Records Division has records in its custody that are just a few years old, which benefits those researchers working on contemporary research topics. Of course, there are researchers out there who don't get electronic records and raw data. It's okay, I can say that. I used to be one of those people. An example of the raw data held by the National Archives are those census forms that you filled out in 2010 and will do so again in 2020 during the last decennial census. All of those bubbles you filled in, and even some of the marginalia that you may have written, was captured by the archives and preserved so that future generations can see where you stood for the 2010 census. As an archivist for more than 20 years, I've been working with electronic records for the past 11, and I wasn't sure how this was all going to work when I started. We'll often get inquiries from researchers who have come to us from the paper side of the house, and when we explain the intricacies of electronic records and raw data, their eyes get very wide and they admit they've made a serious mistake and they really don't want what we have. Basically, the electronic records at the National Archives range from statistical data, email, PDF documents, agency newsletters, and Department of the Interior geospatial maps, just to name a few. These are records created in a machine-readable or computer format that require a computer for access. Obviously, this means most of our holdings date from World War II, when federal agencies began using computers in carrying out regular government functions. One of the primary access tools available to researchers, and the focus of my portion of the session, is NARA's Access to Archival Databases, or AAD. AAD contains more than 174 million individual records across 66 different series. AAD covers subjects ranging from genealogy and personal history topics like immigration and military casualty and service records to government spending and international relations, just to name a couple of examples. If you ask many of our users, I think they might tell you the greatest feature of AAD is that it takes the raw statistical data and presents it in a user-friendly format to search and view individual records. AAD is one of the most popular tools used by researchers, receiving more than 2.6 million hits per year, an average of about 7,200 hits in the most recently completed fiscal year. A good analogy to describe AAD is they are the self-service gas pumps of the National Archives. A researcher can pull up to the portal and get what they're looking for with relative ease. If you're looking for one individual record, what happened to your buddy in Vietnam? What year did your grandfather enlist in the Army in World War II? What was the name of the ship that brought your ancestors to the United States? These answers can all be found in AAD. In just a few moments, I'll show how to search in the Japanese American internee data file to locate individuals who were detained during World War II. In addition to the records that Jana and I will discuss in detail, there are a wide variety of records available to researchers to learn more about this unfortunate chapter in American history. Via the first link on this slide, researchers can find resources regarding Japanese Americans and World War II. Through the National Archives Library Catalog, or ALEC, there are a number of books that researchers can review while working on their issue of interest. There's also an entire reference paper, or RIP, number 70, which details the audiovisual materials pertaining to World War II in the collections of the National Archives. There are also a number of links on that page that direct researchers to external links outside the archives pertaining to Japanese heritage. There's also a number of both NARA and non-NARA resources available through the webpage listed on the slide, including some teaching materials for use in the classroom to teach the subject of Japanese American relocation. On the second webpage linked above, researchers can find the most requested information about the records at NARA that relate to World War II Japanese American internees. You can also explore our online search tools to find information about our Japanese American records, which I will demonstrate shortly. You can also obtain order forms and information about how to place an order for copies of materials, as well as discover further steps you can take to research the internment of Japanese Americans and Japanese during World War II. So let's take a look specifically at the records Jana and I will be discussing today. As noted on the previous slide, one of the items that researchers can use to locate records concerning the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II is the Japanese American internee data file, available for searching and viewing in AAD. These records were created by the War Relocation Authority, or WRA, to collect information on individual evacuees on WRA Form 26. The data was used by the WRA to support the management of individuals and the relocation centers in general. As mentioned earlier, the original punch cards were converted in the 1960s by the Bancroft Library at the University of California at Berkeley. Subsequently, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice used the data file to support distribution of reparations to former evacuees. In this series, there are more than 100,000 records of individual evacuees from Washington State, Oregon, and California to 10 relocation centers: Tule Lake and Manzanar in California, Minidoka in Idaho, the Central Utah Center, Colorado's Granada Center, Colorado and Gila River in Arizona, Hart Mountain in Wyoming, and the Rower and Jerome in Arkansas. Found within each record are the individual's name, the relocation project, assembly center to which they were assigned, the evacuee's previous address, along with other family information. Before we begin searching in the WRA records, we need to address the reason why Japanese Americans were relocated in the first place. As I noted earlier, Executive Order 9066 was issued by President Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, which authorized the evacuation of all persons deemed a threat to national security from the West Coast to 10 relocation centers that I noted earlier. In the years between the Civil War and the advent of World War II, almost 300,000 Japanese immigrated to Hawaii and the mainland United States, with the majority arriving between 1898 and 1924. That same year, quotas were adopted that effectively ended Asian immigration. As was the case with many other immigrant groups, Japanese Americans settled in ethnic neighborhoods and established their own schools, houses of worship, and economic and cultural institutions. This concentration was further increased by real estate agents who would not sell properties to Japanese Americans outside of existing Japanese enclaves, along with a 1913 act passed by the California Assembly that restricted land ownership to only those eligible to be U.S. citizens. In 1922, the U.S. Supreme Court in Ozawa v. United States upheld the government's right to deny U.S. citizenship to Japanese immigrants. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, lobbyists from Western states, many representing economic interests or nativist groups, pressured Congress and the President to remove persons of Japanese descent from the West Coast. During congressional committee hearings, Department of Justice representatives raised constitutional and ethical objections to the proposal, so the U.S. Army carried out the task instead. The West Coast was divided into military zones. Congress implemented the order in March of 1942, passing Public Law 503. After encouraging voluntary evacuation of the areas, the Western Defense Command began involuntary removal and detention of West Coast residents of Japanese ancestry. In the next 6 months, approximately 120,000 men, women, and children were moved to assembly centers. Nearly 70,000 of the evacuees were American citizens who were not charged, nor could they appeal their incarceration. All lost personal liberties, most lost homes and property as well. Some Japanese Americans challenged the government's actions in court cases. However, the Supreme Court upheld their legality. Individuals who were born in the United States, but whose parents were Japanese immigrants, or Nisei as they were known, were encouraged to serve in the armed forces, and some were also drafted. Altogether, more than 30,000 Japanese Americans served with distinction during World War II in segregated units. Following the war, various individuals and groups sought compensation for the internees. The speed of the evacuation forced many homeowners and businessmen to sell out quickly. The Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act of 1948, with amendments adopted in 1951 and 1965, provided token payments for some property losses. More serious efforts to make amends took place in the early 1980s, when the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians held investigations and made recommendations. As a result, several bills were introduced in Congress from 1984 through 1988 when Public Law 100-383 was passed, which acknowledged the injustice of the internment, apologized for it, and provided for restitution. Now, before we get into the specifics of searching some of the records in AAD, I want to take a few moments to show how best use AAD for what it is to find what you're looking for. The AAD homepage is shown here along with the URL that will help you get to where you want to be, if AAD is that place. The yellow arrow on the right of the slide points to the Getting Started guide, which is similar to one of the handouts posted for this presentation, and it's a good place to start for those novices using AAD. Also available under the AAD tools and FAQs and a glossary to assist researchers in using AAD. Also available on the home page are 3 sections shown by the purple, teal, and blue arrows: What's New, AAD Highlights, and Most Popular. The What's New section highlights those series that have been recently added to AAD. The AAD Highlights sections identifies selected prominent individuals in the AAD records that may be of interest to researchers. Available on this list are records for 2 of the 3 individuals that I will be discussing shortly. The Most Popular section lists those series that are, well, most popular and most frequently searched by researchers. In the green search box next to the green arrow, researchers can enter text that will search across all of the available series in AAD. If you're interested in a specific topic, you can also browse by category next to the red arrow, and you also have the option of searching by subject by clicking on the Browse by Subject in the lower right corner of the red box. If you choose a particular category or subject on the series listing page, the green search box will change to search only those series that fit into the category or subject that you were looking for. Under each particular series, you may search in the free text box within that particular series, or you may search in any of the particular fields that comprise that series. And I'll show a more specific example of that in a moment. Now let's look a little further into AAD and specifically the Japanese American internee data file and look at the records for 3 individuals who were interned during World War II. Robert Matsui served in the United States Congress from 1978 until his death in 2005, representing California's 3rd and later 5th district. Born in September of 1941, he was just 6 months old when his family was interned at the Tule Lake Relocation Center in Northern California. He and his family remained in a camp until Matsui was nearly 4 years old. In addition, during their confinement, Matsui's mother contracted measles while pregnant and gave birth to a daughter who was born blind. Later, when Matsui was elected to Congress, he was instrumental in seeking compensation for those Japanese Americans who were interned in the camp, the same compensation that I referred to earlier. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that apologized for the relocation and established a trust fund to pay reparations to those who were placed in the camp. In addition to Matsui, his wife Doris went on to serve in Mr. Matsui's seat, was also interned in a camp. Now, I'm going to do a little live searching in AAD, and if that doesn't work, there is a handout that we can use. So to locate Congressman Matsui's record in AAD, you'd start on the AAD homepage, and you could click on Civilians in the Browse by Category box. The Japanese American internee data file should appear about 8th down the list. Right there. And you click on the Search Radio button, and you can then search either in the green search box or by placing search terms in the fielded search box. So if we put in the congressman's name in the free text box, we will return just the one record. And by clicking on the piece of paper icon, you can view the full record as shown here. So the fields that are shown in the full record are the individual's first and last name, other vital information, the name of the assembly and relocation centers through which they were processed, the last address where the individual lives, the occupation and birthplaces of the individual's parents, and the amount of time the individual may have spent in Japan. So you can see here that Mr. Matsui was interned at Tule Lake, processed through the Pinedale Center. His family was from Sacramento, that he had spent no time in Japan. As I had noted, he was born in the United States, and that he did not have an alien registration nor a social security number, had not attended a Japanese language school. In fact, he had not yet started school as he was only born in 1941. Also to be noted in the record is the case number, which can be used to discover the textual case files and cards in the custody of the National Archives. Now, our second individual is one who's neither a political personality nor a frontline entertainer, as is our next individual. Iwao Takamoto was an animator, television producer, and film director. He learned most of his illustration skills while interned at Manzanar from two other internees who had been art directors at film studios. Following the war, Takamoto joined Walt Disney Studios, working on such Disney classics as Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, and 101 Dalmatians. He received a job offer from Walt Disney based on the illustration books that he had created in the internment camp. In 1961, Takamoto left Disney for Hanna-Barbera Productions as a character designer. He is credited with the design of Scooby-Doo as well as the Jetsons' dog Astro. He was also the director of the films Charlotte's Web and the Jetsons movie. He later chronicled his experiences in Manzanar and his life in cartoons in his memoir, My Life with 1,000 Characters. Now, another option for finding the Japanese-American internee data file is you can click on the World War II category under Wars and International Relations, and you'll get a list of 5 series specific to World War II. Now, again, using the free text search box, we can type in Takamoto, and we will get 33 records in the Japanese-American internee data file. And Mr. Takamoto, appears second here on the list. Again, clicking on the piece of paper icon, we can see that Mr. Takamoto was assembled and interned at Manzanar. Both of his parents were born in Japan. He had spent less than 6 months in Japan, where he attended school, and he speaks Japanese and also reads, writes, and speaks English. Now, in order to give you a little preview of Jana's presentation, the important piece of information in this record is the assembly center, along with the individual's name. If you are in possession of that information, you can easily get to the records that Jana is going to discuss shortly, which document the management and disposal of properties and goods of those individuals who were involved in both the voluntary and involuntary evacuation of individuals from their homes. In many cases, the records that Jana will discuss do not have case numbers, as it was before case numbers were assigned to the individuals. The records are primarily arranged by geographic location, where individuals would have been directed to a nearby assembly center, and then by the center itself. Now, George Takai, or Hosato Takai, as we will see in a moment, was born in 1937. His family was living in Los Angeles, and when the relocation of Japanese Americans began, his family was set first to the War Relocation Center in Arkansas before being transferred to the Tule Lake Center in California. Takei also had relatives living in Japan, 2 of whom actually perished in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in 1945. After a few small film roles in television and film, Takei was cast as Lieutenant Hikaru Sulu in the television series Star Trek in 1965. He also appeared as Sulu in all 6 of the Star Trek movies that featured the original TV cast. A vocal activist for human rights, Takei recently also starred in a project that he created, a musical titled Allegiance, which used his experiences from his time in the internment camps. Takei wrote, "I was just a child of 5 when we were forced at gunpoint from our home and sent first to live in a horse stable at a local racetrack. A family of 5 crammed into a single smelly stall. It was a devastating blow to my parents, who had worked so hard to buy a house and raise a family in Los Angeles. After several weeks, they sent us much farther away, 1,000 miles to the east by rail car. The blinds of our train cars pulled for our own protection, they said. We disembarked in the fetid swamps of Arkansas at the War Relocation Center. Really, it was a prison. Armed guards looked down upon us from sentry towers, their guns pointed inward at us. Searchlights lit pathways at night. We understood. We were not to leave. My parents did their best to make life seem normal. As a child, I very readily accepted our new circumstance and adjusted to it. As far as I was concerned, it was normal to line up to use the common latrine or to eat wretched grub in a common mess hall, prisoners in our own country. It was normal for us to share a single small barrack with no privacy whatsoever, and it was normal to stand each day in our makeshift classroom reciting the words of the Pledge of Allegiance, with liberty and justice for all. As I looked past the US flag out the window, the barbed wire of the camp just visible behind it. Now, yet another way to find your way to the Japanese American internee data file is to browse by subject. So from the AAD homepage, you can click on the Browse by Subject link, and then you can go down to Japanese Americans, and that will return the data file on its own. Now, if you go to the search page for the Japanese American internee data file and you search George Takai, you're not going to find anything, because you need to know that even though his father had named him George after George VI, whose coronation had taken place shortly after Takei's birth in 1937, you'd have to know that his name was born Hosato Takai. So, and then you'll get his record. And you will see that Takei was brought to the Assembly Center at Santa Anita Racetrack, then sent to the Rower Center in Arkansas. Takei's father was born in Japan, while his mother was born in the United States. Born in 1937, Takei was still attending school and had never been to Japan. I hope that you've enjoyed this examination of the records of the Japanese American internee data file available through AAD. I've also endeavored to show you the corollary records that exist in the National Archives, including the records that my friend and colleague Jana will talk to you about in a moment. If there are any questions, or if there are any individuals who'd like to see some additional searching conducted in AAD, we can do that as time allows at the end of Jana's presentation. Just send in your questions via chat, Twitter, or whatever social media platform you're using for today's fair. Thank you very much for tuning into this session. I hope that you've learned something about the rather dark chapter in American history and how the records can illustrate how anyone can overcome adversity to become successful members of American society. And now I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague, Jana Leighton.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone. As John mentioned, I will be discussing electronic records on the other side of the spectrum. The two series San Francisco branch evacuee property files, March 18, 1942 to June 1946, and the Portland branch evacuee property files, March 18, 1942 to June 30, 1946, consist of records that were not born digital. Originally, they were produced on paper, migrated to a digital format, and transferred to the National Archives onto hard drives. But before we move on to discuss the records in further detail and how you can access them at home, I want to draw your attention to the image featured on the slide. It comes from the series Central Photographic Files of the War Relocation Authority, 1942 to 1945. The photo was taken by famed photographer Dorothea Lange on April 4th, 1942 in San Francisco, California. It depicts a businessman of Japanese ancestry conferring with a representative from the Federal Reserve Bank, and it is likely the photograph was taken while some of the records we will be exploring were being produced. I believe it helps illustrate how these files were made, and that knowledge may be helpful in finding the information you seek. As John discussed earlier, with the issuance of Executive Order 9066 by President Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, the Secretary of War was able to designate military areas and order evacuation of all persons deemed a threat to national security. This primarily affected the West Coast of the United States, and the Federal Reserve Bank was tasked as being the fiscal agent of the U.S. government. In response to Executive Order 9066, the Evacuee Property Department was established, and the Evacuee Property Program was initiated in March of 1942. Originally, the program fell under the jurisdiction of the Wartime Civil Control Administration. However, on March 18, 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9102, establishing the War Relocation Authority, or WRA. And the Evacuee Property Program ultimately came under that agency's organizational authority. The Federal Reserve Bank branches created and maintained these records to provide assistance in relocation, maintenance, and the supervision of evacuee property during World War II. In 1946, the WRA was abolished by Executive Order 9423 and was replaced by the War Agency Liquidation Unit within the Department of Interior, or DOI. So although the Federal Reserve Bank is not a federal agency, the records created while the Federal Reserve Bank acted as the fiscal agent of the WRA, they are considered to be federal records. Physical custody of the records had been retained by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco until their transfer to the National Archives and Records Administration in March 2016. During the same month, the records were illegally transferred to NARA from the Department of Interior, as they were still the legal federal custodian. The two series belong to Record Group 210, the records of the War Relocation Authority, and are similar in content but different in volume. The records document the management and disposal of properties and goods as identified by the WRA, as directed by Executive Order 9066 and 9102. They consist of correspondence, reports, and case files pertaining to the property of individual families and businesses impacted by the involuntary evacuation and relocation, due in part to their foreign national status or Japanese ancestry. Nationalities represented within these records include, but are not limited to, German, Italian, and Japanese. Many of the documents produced at the Los Angeles branch of the Federal Reserve Bank were believed to have been incorporated into the San Francisco branch file collection while under the physical control of the San Francisco branch. We believe this is to be the main reason for the discrepancy in volume, although it may have to do with the difference in size of the Japanese American population located in Oregon compared to California. The subjects covered in both series include internment, military restricted areas, civilian exclusion orders, wartime civil control administration, U.S. Employment Service, the Farm Security Administration, and the Japanese Citizens League. Please note, few of the records are in Japanese. The Portland branch files include 98 file units, viewable and downloadable as PDFs. There are 6,184 tagged image file formats, or TIFFs, that correspond with the images that make up 97 of the file units. One of the file units consists of the finding aid and does not correspond to any TIFFs. The San Francisco branch evacuee property file includes 12 file units described in the catalog and comprised of 345 PDFs, with 127,788 corresponding TIFFs. The finding aid associated with this series was created by NARA staff. It can be found similar to the one in the Portland branch series by navigating your way to it within the National Archives catalog. When finding your way to the catalog, I suggest making your way to the National Archives and Records Administration's website at archives.gov. You should land on a page with multiple colored tabs, and then you'll find your way to the Research Our Records tab. It is the one that looks grayish in color. This will take you to the page that you can then click on Search the Catalog within the Research in the National Archives Catalog tab. After being redirected to the National Archives Catalog landing page, put in the search term branch property files. Both the San Francisco branch property files and the Portland branch property files should be shown at the top of the query result page. If you click on either of the series, it will bring you to the series description where you can then access the file units by making your way to the details section, then clicking on the link located in the includes field directly above the function and use field. Please note that if you have or intend to download the presentation slides available through the virtual Genealogy Fair webpage, all the links I included in this presentation are live and should bring you to the should allow you to direct access to the corresponding address. Some useful tips to remember when you're looking at these records is to first look at the finding aids for each series. The NARA Creative Finding Aid available for the San Francisco series will probably help you from pulling out your hair or spending too much time in a PDF you really don't need to read. I really, really suggest this. The finding aid for the Portland branch files was produced by the Federal Reserve Bank and gives more of a folder level description, as it corresponds more to the original format of the records. It is important to know the report of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, Evacuation Operations, Pacific Coast Military Area, 1942, that lies within the Portland branch series gives an overview of the obligations and operation of the Federal Reserve Bank in 1942. And that means you can use it as a reference tool for both record series. All of the records within both series are available for download and accessible online. Also, all of the records are scanned for optical character recognition, or OCR. This means you can search within PDFs both in your browser and as a downloadable document. One thing to consider is that many of the records are handwritten, and therefore OCR is less accurate. I would still suggest using the search capabilities within the files as a first step in trying to find the specific names or details that you are seeking. Many of the PDFs or file units include over 250 pages each. Unlike an AAD, many of the records within these two series utilize the evacuee's nickname or American name and not their legal or Japanese name. As many of these records were made prior to evacuation, the family number may not be given. It can be, as some of the records were produced while families were relocated. Many times, only one member of the family served as the point of contact. So although the family may be represented within the files, individuals of each family may not be named. As these records were made for carrying out the business of the government, a significant quantity of these records are forms, and the forms were made out in duplicate and sometimes triplicate. However, what may look like the same document that can be found across multiple file units may also hold unique information that will be helpful for your search. For the San Francisco branch files, it is really important to understand the records were originally paper, migrated to microfilm, and then microfilm was digitized into TIFFs. This is reflected in the order for which the records appear, and they may seem backwards. Please pay special attention to the page numbers and dates within the records. As I stated previously, many of the records contain information prior to relocation. From a researcher perspective, this means many of the details, such as the address and phone numbers, may be helpful for locating more information on those represented within the records. This is what an interview form looks like within the records. They make up a significant portion of both series and hold a couple of important details that may interest genealogy researchers. It includes many data points that may help in finding more information about your subject. On this interview form, for example, the subject interviewed is Dave M. Tatsuno. The highlighted sections include the name, address prior to evacuation, if the interview was done by phone or in person, and a telephone number of either their home or business. Also noted is an indication of if the property being discussed is personal or business, and citizenship of the interviewee is usually captured. An important thing to know is that in some of the interview forms, it is apparent a bank representative filled out the form, while in others you can see that it was filled out by the interviewee. In fact, not all of those who were interviewed were forced to evacuate or relocate. Many of those interviewed included business partners, neighbors of evacuees, and those who may have had a vested interest in property or a relationship to someone being relocated. Mr. Tatsano actually appears in a few cases discussing other people's property. Mr. Tatsano, along with his family, are subjects of photos taken by Dorothea Lange, available in the Central Photographic File of the War Relocation Authority series. He was a businessman and president of the Japanese American Citizens League San Francisco's chapter prior to evacuation. As seen in this photo, Mr. Tatsano and his father are standing outside their dry goods store, which the previous form was discussing. Mr. Tatsuno filled out multiple forms regarding his business, as well as forms regarding the family's personal property. Personal property forms are another type of record that make up a significant portion of these series. Many of the documents seem to have been produced while evacuees were in assembly centers before being moved to internment camps. This means they may or may not include family numbers. It is important to note that the dates of the forms and the location of storage. This may help when trying to locate information and records within the series. Geographical references are central to the organization of these records. Many of the PDFs are titled by geographic location and or the bank representative representing each section of the Western region. It may even be beneficial to have a Google Maps open to help aid in your search. I know it was certainly beneficial when I was helping process the records that I'm a California native and very familiar with the geography. Motor vehicle registration forms, like personal property forms, indicate important information that may be useful for genealogical research. The names of owners, family number, address prior to evacuation, license number, engine number, date first sold, and type of vehicle are all included on this form. If you can't find the information on your subject in one type of form, you may find that they filled out a different form that has the pertinent information you need. As John said, and Gwen will soon elaborate, there are a multitude of different resources at your disposal within NARA's holdings. If you don't find what you are seeking in these records, you may find them in other collections. I wish you all the luck on your search. And thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, let us know.
Thank you very much. I have a question that did come in, and I'm going to allow folks to type in their questions into either the YouTube chat, or you can also do GenFair 2017, hashtag GenFair 2017. Either way, we'll capture your question and ask the presenter. And I'm hesitating as I'm trying to find the question that I had for you.
All right.
Definitely had a question that popped up. I have too many, here we go, too many forms up. The question that came in goes back to earlier in the presentation. Are there exact addresses provided in the online data or just the city that they came from?
It primarily is just the city in which the individual lived. So, as you can see here, last permanent address, county, Los Angeles. Last permanent address, state, Pacific States. Last permanent address, Los Angeles, California. So it's not their exact street addresses. Although that information may be in the textual records that are available.
Okay, thank you. So it is possible. Is it possible to enlarge that screen, or is that what you'll see on AAD? I just want to make sure. I do believe you should be able to enlarge it at home.
Right.
Are there any more questions from our online audience? I am not seeing any at this time. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Certainly you can enlarge that. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we let you go?
Within the finding aid within the finding aid of the San Francisco branch series, the assembly center is really important, as John mentioned. And usually anybody who went through the assembly center was given an interview form, and there you can find addresses. And so if you know, if you go to AAD and find out which assembly center, you can then look within the finding aid for San Francisco branch and correlate that. And hopefully you can get the actual street address or apartment number, or at least a place of contact.
Thank you. We've already got a thank you back from the person who asked that question. She says she's going to let her cousins know. So that's all the questions that I have at this time. I'm sure we'll get some more as people think more about these records. If you do have a question that comes up later, you can send it directly to the electronic records staff at cer@nara.gov.